All right, while we're setting up, can you hear me okay? So, she asked me if I want to stand behind the podium or walk. Given those two choices, what would you choose to do? So we found this setup. So thank you very much to the to INCOSE and to the Healthcare Working Group for inviting me to be the speaker and for allowing me to talk about this topic, because this is an important topic, and I realize this is something that may have some application to what we're talking about with the working group is trying to develop. Hopefully, I can give you some perspectives on some components of the system that maybe are not readily apparent that they should be considered. I understand this is the second meeting of the working group, and so I think this is very timely. Let me also say my two brothers are here in the audience. I don't think they've ever heard me speak before, except in some of the change of commands that they would come to. Unfortunately, our mother passed away last Friday, and so we've had a chance to really bond, and it's nice to see them there, Ron and Lou. Thanks for being here. They're not engineers. Maybe my older brothers, I'm not sure. But they're not in healthcare. So this, and they've never heard this talk before. So it's kind of new for them as well. So we have, you see here, and Bill, thank you for the gracious introduction. Appreciate that. So the CJTF 7, Combined Joint Task Force 7, was the Operation Iraqi Freedom 1, the first element of effort in Iraq in 2003. You may remember we crossed the line on 19 March. I was a part of the 30th Medical Brigade. I was of the 5th Corps, which was the C2 for the operation. And I had the good fortune of not just executing the medical component of the operation, but also to be present in the entire planning process. And the people sitting at the table were Dave Petraeus and Ray Ordierno, and the first MEF commander went on to be the commandant of the Marine Corps, and General Wallace, who was overall in charge of everything. And I had the medical component, and my battle buddy had the signal component. My other battle buddy had the engineering component, and the guy next to him had there were two aviation components, one for attack and one for movement. So now we start talking about integration of systems. You can start to see how all of that from the day one, from planning, I'll go through some of what we did in planning. I took over the 30th Medical Brigade in June of 2002, and we launched our attack in March 2003. So that's 6 straight months, a lot of time, in Kuwait, a lot of time in simulation exercises, a lot of time doing live exercises, one in Poland, one in Eastern Germany, one in our home station, and we exercise. You might call it model, sometimes with forces, sometimes with leaders, sometimes just with large map boards of people walking around, just like you see on TV. So this isn't something that just happened. Maybe we can get a little bit into how do we get systems to work. They don't work because they just fit together. They work because there is an effort to identify where those points of intersection are and where the opportunities for collaboration and coordination occur. And I knew exactly where everybody was going to be at any point in time on the battlefield, or where they were expected to be. I knew where every potential chemical and biologic exposure was going to be. We war gamed that. I knew where every high intensity conflict opportunity was going to take place versus a low intensity conflict. I knew where every hospital in Iraq was located through intelligence sources, and I designed a team so we would have that awareness that as we were maneuvering up through Iraq, occupying, we would be able to go and see what the capabilities were in the host nation, because I also knew, as a theater surgeon, I was responsible for the health care of the host nation until the cessation of the effort. So This not only involved the evolution of a coalition force of over 300,000 forces. At that time it was just the British when we initially launched the attack, but eventually it became 33 nations that brought efforts, and many of them only brought medical efforts. Why? Because it's an easy effort to bring to the battlefield, and there's goodness in it, and that gives, and that's very palatable to the host nation, or to the nation that's contributing forces. We had a host nation population of 26 million. I knew that about a third of that host nation was managed by something that we call the Director for Military Medical Affairs. Imagine we combine our VA and DoD. Someday we may. Seems like a good idea, right? So as told Bill earlier, the last 5 years I ran an organization that oversaw both VA and DoD. It was interesting because we were able to pull in data. So the thing that we share patients, the thing we never share is information. So it became something of a personal effort to try to change that paradigm on my part. And to this point, the only data clinical registry that exists is called the Defense and Veterans Eye Injury and Vision Registry. I'm an ophthalmologist, a retina specialist by training. And it just about 5 months ago, after 5 years of trying, finally received permission to combine the information for the cohorts of patients who experienced eye injuries into a single clinical registry. So we can do this long-term outcomes analysis, time course characterization. What impact did this intervention have? What impact did this injury mechanism have? What impact and now we're starting to go, what impact did the genomics have on the outcomes of the care? I'm still very active in the arena of traumatic brain injury. If you care to look up ARVO, the Association for Research in Vision and Ophthalmology, we just hosted our third international conference on traumatic brain injury and visual dysfunctions in Seattle. It's gaining in recognition. You've watched movies like Concussion, you've read some articles like League of Denial, the NFL's perspective, and we were trying to grab the NFL and say, partner with us about what's happening from blast injuries to our soldiers on the battlefield. Mechanisms are the same. One exposure, and you have a lifetime of a chronic deterioration of your neural matter, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, and it doesn't stop, and your brain continues to deteriorate with time, and we don't know how to treat it. We don't even know how to diagnose it. We don't know how to biomark it. We don't know how to. So I'm very active in that, and this is the third time I've moderated that conference. Coach Jim Zorn was on the panel this year. For his first question. Jim McDermott, physician and congressman from the area of Seattle, opened the conference, and Patty Murray, the senator from Washington State, couldn't make it, but she sent a nice 15-minute video talking about the importance of it. We hope to continue to do that. It's really dramatic, and it's through the registry that we're able to uncover these things. It's through the information. We didn't know about this before we entered Iraq. We didn't know about this before we started getting these exposures. We kind of thought the NFL was going through some of it because you read these articles, but they weren't talking about it because they didn't want to have some accountability issues. And Ann McKee, who's also on our panel, was the one who recently testified before Congress, did her presentation, and then the congressional hearing said, so NFL, what do you think? Is it real or not? And it was the first time they ever admitted it's real, and that happened just about a month ago. So now hopefully we'll see some movement in the direction of helping those. Why is it important to me? Because our soldiers are being exposed to these high energy blast injuries that have not just an eye issue, but not just a brain issue, but other neurologic issues. And the eye is probably the most serious consequence of these exposures. The eye is an extension of the brain. It is actually the brain. It just happens to be locatable on the front of the face. Okay, so I talked about 26 million. About a third of that 26 million cared for by the military healthcare system, combined VA. Kind of our two largest healthcare systems in the United States are the DoD, federal, and the VA. They're the two largest, and you combine them together. For sure, they're the two largest independently. 9.2 million beneficiaries in about each of those. So that gets up to about 18 million people. that are cared for by the DoD and the VA. Same thing in Iraq, a country that's been at war for 15 years before we occupied it. Well, we eventually grew up to about 26,000 detainees, EPWs. That's part of the hub. The occupying force is responsible for, and we continue to be responsible for that through years until we finally said we're no longer going to be in Iraq. Never were able to fully transition that over to the Iraqis. Many of you watched the CNN reports about ISIS and the growth of ISIS and how that happened in some of the detainee camps, particularly the one, Camp Buka, down in Basra, southern Iraq. That happened over the years after I left, where there were 26,000 detainees just in that one camp. And the other thing is, our goal, the end state, we wargamed this end state. The end state was a free and democratic, a democratic Iraq led by a free and democratic Iraq. Democratic Iraq led by a free people. Our goal was to eliminate the autocratic governance, to put into process the transition to a democratic form of governance, and to be a partner with this free nation of Iraq. So that was the war-gamed end state. It turned out that way. I don't know how you model that one, but anybody want to ask me questions along the way, let me know. This is just an introduction. And then put all that on top of it, a somewhat hostile work environment that we had to build systems to do all of this. I would say when somebody's shooting at you every day, I'd call that hostile work environment. Okay, so what this was the largest maneuver operation since Korea, the only nation-state occupation since World War II, and the first in which we were really building a sustainment base to make this effort go. I guess you could say Kosovo was a little bit of a nation occupation, and I will tell you, as you hear the story, I was very fortunate because all of the units I commanded. You heard us command the 30th Med Brigade, but I've been commanded of the MASH Hospital, the Combat Support Hospital, the Fixed Facility Hospital. I was in Fort Campbell just before taking over in Germany at the 30th Medical Brigade, and we started this war against terrorism in Afghanistan, OEF, Operation. I forgot what the E stands for.
Enduring freedom.
Yeah, enduring freedom. Thank you. Yeah, very good. And that was Fort Campbell centric. The 5th group were the special forces you saw riding their horses, and they were out of Fort Campbell in those helicopters flying. Were the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment out of Fort Campbell, and the 101st Airborne was the first to deploy in Afghanistan. So very familiar to what was happening in the war effort, at least at the Afghanistan, because I was the commander of the hospital that was on the post at Fort Campbell. I've been very fortunate in that, and over the years I've learned from some great leaders. So I'm going to talk about how we executed this maneuver and this maneuver element to occupy, and then building into a sustainment base with a little discussion going on how did we develop the systems for continuous performance improvement following that sustainment base establishment. Anybody have any questions for me before I launch down and launch into the story of how we did it? Okay? Okay, so raise your hand, stop me. I'll be happy to discuss in any more detail. So there's a few pieces I'd like to start off with. This is a talk that I gave for about 6 years after I came back from Iraq. The course called the Joint Operations Medical Managers course. And I talked about the responsibilities and roles of the medical commander and the medical theater surgeon to people who were deploying to Iraq and Afghanistan in the preparations. It's called the JOMC course, Joint Operations Medical Managers course. So this was a framework I used to speak to. And it's interesting because I was just in preparation, was kind of looking at how does this apply to the systems engineering framework of analyze, design, manage, and measure. It's pretty close when you look at this. We analyze the requirements, align the resources, execute. And as I started talking about the align resources versus designing the system, I really like designing the system. And I'll tell you why right up front. It's because resources are only a small component of the system, of designing the system. And the parts of this that really made us successful, and I'm going to say we were successful in a number of reasons why. One is there was no negative press about the healthcare in Iraq, and the absence of negative press in that environment is a positive outcome. And then I'll show you some numbers about what our achievements were. But the things that really made it work right were things that, like intent. How do you design intent? Commander's intent is that we call some mission command is the term we use in the military. Mission command is based on commander's intent. How do you design that? Yeah. And then commander's intent sets the vision. How do you design that? And then the vision is what then drives decisions. And the idea is if you know the vision, you know the intent, you can now appropriately allocate the decision-making process to a level where the decisions need to be made. I used to always call myself the chief stone kicker, so that other people could do the things they needed to do. So my job was there to get the big obstacles out. If you couldn't go through the door and you couldn't go around and get over it, then my job was to find out why not and fix it. And as the commander, I wasn't the doer. I was the guy that made the doing happen when it couldn't happen under the normal process. So we really were about achieving the end state. I told you we kind of got our mission from higher headquarters, and there's echelons of mission in the military. So just to give that perspective, anybody served in the military prior, so you're familiar with some of this discussion. And anyway, we're in the VA system now, in the DoD. Wow! So I can tell you, you're going to be my honest broker here. So what we really, and I put out some thoughts on this thing, because what I was really designing when we started this was something like kind of used the word zone of trust. How do you design the zone of trust? Well, the components of the zone of trust are the values, the ethics, the perceptions that are derived from the things that you do. We have to gain the trust of the American people. We had to gain the trust of the Iraqi. We had to gain the trust of the coalition. And that's where medical forces became a very valuable asset. And I'll give you a few reasons why I think that. So I put here intent, vision, values, ethics, and perception are key components of the design in healthcare. Because if you're a healthcare practitioner working in a hospital where our mother was recently, and you aren't giving the perception of a caring perspective, you aren't giving the perception that you're aligned with the family's intent, that your behavior is unethical or appears to be unethical, perhaps too much discussion about monetary reimbursement versus the care of a patient isn't patient-centric, then your system will fail. It'll fail. So just some words of advice as we're looking through it. We put the mathematical models on there, and we can do some of the design, and we can look at agent-based and complex systems. But there's a complexity to healthcare that actually is a succeed or fail component. I was telling my brother a story the other day that when I took over the hospital at Fort Campbell, the number one reason why people generated a complaint was staff attitude. People didn't want to come to our hospital. Why? Not because the healthcare was bad, but because the attitude was bad. And so I set about to change that. Brought in some service training, service leaders, established a kind of what I call bot care meeting, and positive reinforcement of good behavior, good outcomes. Share that with the whole group. Brought in, purchased some recognition for each individual. Usually the staff attitudes at the front desk, and everybody knows this, but so if you go to the front desk, or you try to park in the parking lot, you go to the front desk, and those things, those parts of the systems aren't working, the outcome will always be poor. It doesn't matter how good your healthcare is. So I started this little model of we know that people are going to come here to Bach, Blanchard Army Community Hospital, and they're going to get good care. They're going to get great health care. But when they leave, we want them to feel cared for. That's the other soft component of this system. You're going to get, when you come in, you're going to get great care. When you leave, you will feel cared for. Those are things that we tried to put into this system we were deploying on the battlefield. Why? Because humanity in the melee is one of the functions of the medical system. It is the humanity melee. And I really feel pleased because one of my subordinate commanders, I think I have a picture of him here, Pat Sargent, was then Lieutenant Colonel Pat Sargent, now is Major General Pat Sargent. And in his promotion to Brigadier General, he said, I'm proud to be part of a system that is the humanity in the melee. For me, that was, I conveyed that to one of my subordinate leaders, and it became one of their important elements. So another piece that I'm going to mention is leader development. If we aren't thinking about how we evolve a system that allows growth in knowledge, and not just growth in knowledge about outcomes, but growth in knowledge about how to take care of people. It's a people interface, and you have to be thinking about taking care of people when you do this work. So, okay, so any questions about that? I'm on slide 1, I'm not 2, so it's good. So this that design. So we're designing. Design is a way to align resources, but there's also it's the way to approach the functions. So you're really there's design the functions, or function, or it's the function of design or the design of the function. It's really the design of the function. And you have to break sometimes these functions down into components in order to make these functions make sense. So, and some of those components are not purely mathematical. They have to have an element of interaction, and that interaction is not automatically known as something that has to be learned. So that's just a summary of kind of what I was going with some of this introduction as we do this talk. And really, what you want to achieve, what your end state goal is how that design should be put in place. And then, of course, agility. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we have to do. Requirements. Analyze requirements. Strategic, operational, and tactical. So we call this the medical operations systems. They actually call them medical BOSS, medical battlefield operating systems. But to be consistent, I switched them around. And you'll see here things: leadership, command and control, hospitalization, evacuation, logistics, blood, area medical support. That's just general health care delivered to that aren't hospital requiring. Preventive medicine, health of the force, dental care, combat stress, very important. I'll tell a little story about that. And food inspection. When we deploy, we can't just go downtown and buy the food. We have to buy from known sources that go all the way back to where the seed is planted and the constitutions of the soil where it's growing. And that that's a part of the food inspection process for the military. And I added these two, resuscitative surgery and medical civil affairs. And they've become, both of these have become important elements of the battlefield operating systems. Again, these slides, this talk, I started giving this talk in about 2005 and stopped giving it about 2011. And some of these are the original slides from that talk, just to give you a feel for what we were telling people before they deployed. Okay, and so here was our other requirement. This is Iraq. It's about 600 miles long and about 500 miles wide. It's about a third of the size of the state of Texas. And so we had to design a healthcare system and overlay it on this. And somehow move from Kuwait, enter up and disperse and create healthcare for about 300,000 forces and initially for about 26 million people. Okay, that's a pretty complex system. So I'm going to tell you how we did it, and of course always open to criticism. One of the things that I always, that I learned in a lot of my reading of World War II, MacArthur, Marshall Plan, is that you really have to seek in war, we're really seeking a better peace. And I would say the end state of war is a better peace. So in order to win the war, we have to first win the peace. And so there's a couple of ways you can win the peace. And one of the things that happens is that you can use different components of capability across what we call the spectrum of warfare. Spectrum of warfare goes from high-intensity combat operations all the way down to, well, then it extends down to low-intensity combat operations. They call it LIC, low-intensity conflict. And then peacekeeping, peacekeeping, humanitarian assistance. All of those are the spectrum of warfare. Clearly, there's a role for medical forces on the front end of that high-intensity conflict. That's what we traditionally think about. But we often forget about the strategic role of medical forces in the humanitarian assistance peacekeeping component. I was a little fortunate because I also had forces deployed to Kosovo and Bosnia and made multiple trips out to Pristina to kind of watch how this was happening in a peacekeeping environment. And the role of military medical forces, the U.S. military medical forces eventually transitioned to the Germans. So medical forces really are a strategic maneuver element critical to achieving the end state of war, which is a better peace. So as we were designing our operation for Iraq, had to remember what the end state was, and the end state is a better peace. Can we get to that end state from emphasis on the lower end of the spectrum of conflict? Yeah, as much as possible. In fact, there was a RAND study that was published just before we made the launch. It was in the late 90s. It was called the 3-block war. And they said in urban operations, you're going to find in one block high-intensity conflict, and in the next block peacekeeping, and in the next block humanitarian assistance. The goal is to keep that high-intensity conflict on that block and not to transition high-intensity conflict where there isn't conflict. So clearly, we had a mission. And I had a great commander in Scott Wallace who really understood the value of medical forces and engineering forces for reconstruction efforts in maintaining this peace. We had this thing called the Coalition Emergency Reconstruction Program funds. David Petraeus spent more than I did, but I spent second of any commander in the theater. I spent it on buying ambulances, doing training for first responders, reconstructing emergency rooms, getting a community that could potentially turn into hostile environment, diffusing that to keeping it a non-hostile environment, using medical assets to quell that intent for conflict. If we can keep people thinking positive about U.S. forces, then I've saved another U.S. life. That's the way I looked at it. And that was my goal. And I will say, in my evaluation from General Wallace, he said, Don's imaginative, or how did he say, innovative use of forward deployed forces and his medical forces saved thousands of U.S., a coalition, and host nation lives. So he got the value and the purpose of this. He understood it. Healthcare, second only to security, is what's critical for establishing a successful nation state. It was just as important to me we had to make it just as important to us to reestablish the rocky healthcare infrastructure, which had been demolished when we occupied. More demolished than we ever expected. I'll tell you a little bit about it. And so that was a lesson learned. We war gamed a little bit of that, but not enough. And there were no NGOs. It was too dangerous. We didn't have Doctors Without Borders. It was too dangerous. And so even the UN, after they were bombed, left. Too dangerous. So we war gamed NGOs. That didn't happen. A lesson learned. Something else to put down there. How do you? I talk about the national will to fight. I learned this from a guy named General Nix, Jack Nix. And he told me, Don, the first few minutes after a soldier is wounded leaves him with a lifetime impression of the quality of his leadership. Always. So be there and be capable at the earliest point of intervention was the model that we had established. That was a transition in thought process from previous war efforts. So we also have a very important influence on the outcomes of combat. In one of our preparations, I think this was in Poland, General Freddie Franks, who was the commander of forces in the Gulf War, Desert Shield, Desert Storm, asked him what he thought was most important for me to be aware of, and I even wrote it down here. He said 2 words, really: be there. Just the same thing that Jack Nix said. And he said, be there, keep your medevac helicopters flying, and be visibly present wherever and whenever soldiers are in combat. People don't realize this, but where there's a combat force, right next to that combat force, there's a medical force. Medical forces are not away from the combat forces. They are next to the combat forces because that's where they can bring the greatest. That's why there's so many Medal of Honor recipients that are medical forces. So we had to war game that component of integration with the medical maneuver force. There was no place where a medical maneuver force went where there wasn't where a combat maneuver force went, where there wasn't a medical maneuver force aligned. Then we had to build the higher levels of capability that were within reasonable distances to save lives. This required me to know not only about where all of my people were, but I had to know where all of the maneuver forces were. I had to know where the priorities of effort were. I had to shift my assets. And I remember before we deployed, because prior to my arrival, there was this thing about the medical brigade commander would be the core rear commander. It didn't sound good to me, but that was part of the problem. I didn't want to be the rear guy. So I war-gamed this. I war-gamed where I could, and I asked General Wallace, I said, "Sir, where do you think I should be?" And he said, in the grand and glorious way, "Effing Don, I'm not going to be able to tell you where you need to be." He said, "Well, wait a minute. You need to be where you can best command your forces." Seems like a simple concept, right? But so I war-gamed that. So when we would do one operation, I was where I would be historically, which is back in the core rear, in the main logistics area. And it took me about 24 to 48 hours longer to gain information than if I had maneuvered forward with the core TAC, which was the Tactical Assault Command. And I realized that I would never be able to influence and command my forces from the rear. A lesson I learned both from Freddie Franks and General Wallace, and from doing it myself and testing. How long would it take me to gain awareness, situational awareness? And the reason why that's so important is because medical forces are slow to move. They're big. Mobility is not totally as a part of it, designed into it. Important part of what needs to happen. So we would have these what we call CPGs, core planning guidance, twice a day, a brief huddle with the commander about here's what we think's happening 96 hours from now. And so let's start doing the backward planning for what we think's in. And I would add on there another 24 hours. So 120 hours was because I'd always try to say, knowing this now, here's what I think is going to happen. And that's because it takes a little longer to get a hospital component maneuvered, and although that wasn't, if we thought we were going to someplace where we thought we were going to be exposed to chemical weapons, I never allowed a potential exposure to be more than 4 hours from a medical response, a mobile medical response to address chemical weapons. And where we thought we were going to have chemical weapons, 2 of our hospitals, we constructed under chemical protective shelters. Took a little longer to do that, but to get that done, I'm going to tell you a story about the battlefield assault on Baghdad, in how the medical requirement caused a little delay in that assault on Baghdad by about 24 hours. So, required us highly trained combat medics, far forward care. We couldn't afford to have any capability that we can execute at the front edge of the battle space. We didn't want to not execute it. We didn't wait till we moved somebody back to give the needed care. Early surgical intervention, rapid evacuation. I had under my command and control 99 helicopters. They were safe half as much as the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force at 150. So large medical asset that allowed me to maneuver the battle space as needed, be there, keep your helicopters flying. This is one of our ISIL shelters. This is usually part of a combat support hospital. 2 surgeons is General John Cho now, who's doing that. He was the deputy commander of the 212th MASH, that's where this is. Forward resuscitative care, hospitals that could move, and constant disease surveillance, and fully integrated medical intelligence. As I said, I knew where every Iraqi hospital was, and I had a team that would go to every one of those facilities and come back and report. Here's their assets, here are their requirements, here's what they need. It became very important because when we hit Baghdad, Corps order came down and said, you're responsible for bringing to pre-war operational level the 40 hospitals in Baghdad. Wow, never counted on that to be one of my missions. So I set up a medical logistics supply capability at Baghdad Airport. I had 6 teams that I pulled from the MASH forward, where every day 6 teams would go out, do an inspection of a hospital, come back, do the requisitions, and do the delivery, delivered over 700 short tons of medical supplies to civilian hospitals in Baghdad in the first few weeks after we arrived in Baghdad, so that they could recover their medical capability, because they had no medical resupply assets other than what we provided. War game that too.
Could you talk a little bit about how you decided to allocate people to different locations? So what was your thought process in terms of how many people were closer to the front, how many people were farther back? How did you structure that, and how did you come?
I'm going to show you a map,
Okay.
and then I'll tell that story a little bit. So, okay. This is an important piece of the ethics that needs to be included in the design. This is a child burn patient inside our chemically protected hospital system, receiving medical care. I always say medical care on the battlefield is medical care. It's no different than a trauma 1 level medical center anywhere. And in fact, one of my outcomes was, if you're injured, there's one place in the world you want to be. That's Baghdad. And when I got my first head trauma case from Afghanistan deployed to Baghdad for management, I knew we'd achieved what we were looking for. And that is, Baghdad is the place where trauma is, people know how to manage trauma and know how to manage it well. And okay. Medical rules of care. They're very legally and morally founded. You have to treat all equally. You can't treat enemy prisoner of war that are injured any differently than you treat your best friend who's injured. That's just not allowed. We had one of our forward surgical teams that arrived, 943rd from Salt Lake City. And they came out here and said, we didn't come here. The commander came in and said, I didn't come here to treat Iraqi prisoners. I said, well, then that's fine. You can go home. Because you're to treat every prisoner as if they were my child. That's how I used to work. They were my child. My child walked in, you would treat them the same way as you treat that prisoner of war. Anybody find, how do you feel about that? They became, he goes, I said, you can go home and I'll write your orders right now. And he said, no, okay, got it. Now I understand your intent and we'll execute. They actually, one of the few units that I gave a V device for Valor on their they gave whole blood to enemy, saved the lives of many enemy prisoners of war after their attitude changed. Attitude's important. So I had the opportunity to kind of actually convey this after we hit Baghdad. We hit Baghdad in mid-April, and the Ministry of Health was totally demolished. And I would make a daily trip up there, sort of hold court, because I was the Minister of Health for all of Iraq. And I called a meeting of the Director Generals, and I actually said, I'm now the Minister of Health, and I need your help. And because you know this system, and I want to bring this back to its full operational capability. Like I said, will we have a job? And I said, that depends on how well you do. So that was how we left it. But I was in the Ministry of Health, and I got called out of a meeting to meet with representatives from the Surgeon General. Remember I said 1/3 of the nation was cared for by the Director of Military Medical Affairs. His name was Lieutenant General Khalid Tawfiq. And the 3 people he sent was a guy named Dr. Shocker, Brigadier General Shocker, Brigadier General Ali, and Brigadier General Faras. And I walked up to them and said, before you say a word to me, I want you to know, I'm going to cry now, some of you, that I treated your soldiers as if they were my children. I told him. You want to know what he replied? And I want you to know I did the same. Shocker. That's the power of this. So when there were 3 U.S. forces captured and being held by the secret police in Mukhawarat of Iraq, he knew they were injured, and he went to speak to them about delivering medical care as the Brigadier General, orthopedic surgeon, and he convinced them that if they did nothing when the war ends, they could be considered war criminals, and they allowed him to do that. So he and a small team brought a radiology device to the prison, and he said, I was the only car on the road because the cruise missiles were landing everywhere, so to his own peril, took the x-rays, convinced them to let him take them to his location to repair their injuries and then turn them over to U.S. forces. So that's the power of medical forces on the battlefield. And I found out that he was also the one who you may remember Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Dr. Rhonda Carnum, whose helicopter crashed and was injured. She was the first female EPW, I think, in that ward, and had several broken limbs, bones, and he also treated her. So I always call him an American hero. So I want you to know I treated your soldiers like they were my children, and I want you to know I did the same. Pretty powerful. Okay, I mentioned some of this earlier. This is an interesting group called the People's Mujahideen of Iran, and PMOI. They had a camp of 13,000 called Camp Al-Shraf, just north of Baghdad. And they were on the terrorist list because they wanted to bring democracy to Iran, which made them Iranian terrorists. So we had to treat them as if they were terrorists in the international community. They were viewed as terrorists. Mostly educated in the United States or Great Britain, 2 hospitals, very skilled medical capability. All I had to do was supply medical logistics. So this is my preventive medicine team that was going up to just do an inspection of this detainee camp that was really, really probably their objective was democracy in Iran. Our objective was democracy in Iraq. It was very hard to think of them as terrorists. So that was one of those. And I will say, after we left, Camp Ashraf was demolished. Many of those people, 13,000, were either captured and returned back to Iran, who knows for what, and or killed. So that was one of the consequences of the war that hurts me the most. Things we've done: body armor, ballistic protection, disease prevention, immunizations, disease surveillance, malaria, influenza, leishmaniasis, environmental hazards. We had sulfur fires, we have yellow cake exposures when we were there, and a lot of toxic chemicals. We knew that there was we had good intelligence there was chemical weapons that we were going to be exposed to. We war gamed that, and every day monitoring where we were on our fatalities and morbidities. We had everybody who deployed had anthrax and smallpox immunization. We did a pre-deployment evaluation. We did a post-deployment evaluation. We tested food and water and the environment continuously. That was a part of the medical responsibility. And we had some capability which totally improved after the first year of the war. There were some joint systems. The Joint Theater Trauma System, that was the first war where we implemented a system that actually monitored patients, every patient injured. It implemented when I was there, but it became in full production after I departed. Joint logistics, joint blood, joint patient tracking, joint telemedicine, joint teleradiology. What that means is the Army, Navy, Air Force do it together. That wasn't always an easy thing to get the Army, Navy, and Air Force to work together. And this was actually one of our first battlefields. I used to say it was easier to manage the Brits and the Poles and the Italians and Spaniards than it was the Air Force. And it was really kind of something that we grew into. It was new for U.S. forces to operate together. Now they do. I'm going to tell a story about this in the future. Okay. Outcomes. What are we measuring now? So I went through the analyze the requirements, design the system, and what are the parameters for designing the system. What are those things that we want and then executing. I'm going to tell you about how we executed this, but and then we measured the outcomes. So our outcomes really are mortality, what we call died of wounds, and KIAs. If you make it to a hospital, you're a died of wounds, or any medical intervention capability. If you die before you make it there, then you're killed in action. And then how much assets does it take, because there was only so much capability that we could deploy. So here's what we ended up with, and I'll talk more about it. A 12% decrease in mortality, a 22% decrease in disease of non-battle injury, and an 8% decrease in the footprint to execute this. Pretty successful. The lowest died of wounds and disease and non-battle injury in history of modern warfare. So that was okay. That got improved. It was okay. It wasn't as great as it could be, because we then learned how we can improve our performance in subsequent years, fully implementing the trauma system and the trauma registry, and learning outcomes. Really started attacking KIAs, which have always been assumed to be something we couldn't really address. Tourniquets, redesigned a new tourniquet so that you can tourniquet yourself. You need somebody else at tourniquet. So it was a combat action tourniquet, and deployed those things. So people were going in combat with these tourniquets pre-positioned on their limbs. And that reduced the KIA, which reduced the mortality. So those are things that we learned from looking at the data as we continued to evaluate it. So here's what happened. 15 March 2003, my team, that's me in the middle, 30th Medical Brigade had a staff of about 196 people. Everything from environmental engineers, radiation physicists, to psychologists, psychiatrists, to operational capability, logistics. This is in Kuwait, and we crossed the line on 19 March. When I took over the 30th Med Brigade in June 2002, I made it pretty clear, having been exposed to what was going on in Operation Enduring Freedom at Fort Campbell, that we really needed to focus ourselves on combat operations. So every commander has the ability to sort of shape the mission focus of the unit. So I was pretty clear. We're going to prepare for combat, we're going to execute combat, and we're going to develop combat leaders. That third one is a very important one. I told you, Pat Sargent said, we're the humanity in the melee. You know, it isn't inherently obvious to everybody how to develop leaders. I don't know if that's a system that we're including in this healthcare component yet. So if we aren't doing that, we may be missing something. So I remember General Cody, we would do these green tab runs where the commanders would come out and run with the commander. He was a division commander at 101st Division Commander. I was one of 10, we call major unit subordinate commanders on Fort Campbell. And he'd go out and run with us, senior leaders, and then we have a little discussion. And his discussion one time said, let's talk about leadership. Let's talk about expectations from leadership. And he said, you know, every one of you guys, I expect you to do the right thing. Like, I pay you to do the right thing. And he said, and I pay the junior leaders to do the correct thing. Everybody get that? The difference between right and correct. Yeah. That's a subtle point, but it's a very important point. And you grow leaders teaching them how to do the correct thing. Follow the rules, follow the guidance, follow the regulations, make decisions that are based on the correct thing. And then when that rule, guidance, or parameter is no longer effective, let's turn it over to the senior leader, who will then make the decision based on ethics, morals, and other legal factors that become more right than correct. And then, before my forces deployed, I would say there's a legal and an ethical component to everything we do. And if you choose the morally correct thing over the legally correct thing, and you can tell me show me why the reasons were that you did that, you will never be alone, no matter how legally incorrect it was. So we sometimes have to also plan for the system to allow decisions to deviate from the standards if the standard may be not correct. And that's what leadership is about. I've seen some head shaking, so that's probably the most important part of my talk. So is that's one of those that if we aren't planning to allow these events to occur that are morally correct. We had one event in Iraq, and when President Bush declared hostilities to have ceased in May, after we arrived in April, that no longer made me the occupying force. It no longer legally allowed me to deliver care to host nation, except in emergency situations. So a young child, injured, shows up at the gate of one of our hospitals and was turned away. It made the press. I mean, that's perception, right? Well, legally we can't. Okay, that's the correct thing. But I had a long talk with the hospital commander, said, morally, you made the wrong choice. And the consequences were suffered because of it. So that's another difference between medical and other. All right, align resources. I'm going to get to your question now. These were the factors: force flow, priority of effort, effective span of control, team building requirements, transitions with phases. When we were moving from maneuver to sustainment, I no longer needed 4 surgical teams. I can combine them into the hospital capability. Retaining flexibility and thinking about future force requirements. So this is from my briefing to the Joint Operations Medical Managers course about factors that influence decisions about aligning of resources. So that and understanding that these are the things you're required to do on the battlefield, so you have to align them to execute these missions in your area of operation. So here was my organization. I had 8 different units, just about 5,000 soldiers. I told you 99 aircraft, probably about 600 ambulances, 4 hospitals, and I aligned them under 2 subordinate organizations called brigades. We were basically a medcom. And so one brigade had 2 hospitals, 3 battalions, 13 companies, 12 detachments, depending on where their area of operation was, and I'll show you that in a second. The other brigade, 62nd Medical Brigade, 1 hospital, 2 battalions, 5 companies, 6 detachments. I created a new brigade that had things that were just a little bit, that needed a little more consolidation of leadership than just going out there. So the mental health teams fell under here, dental teams and vet teams fell under there. They are area-wide and could not be aligned, because I was going to put these in specific areas, and this one I needed this to be area-wide. Medical logistics, aviation, area support. And so these I put individually because I was planning, we deployed them. Once we hit our sustainment base, I was going to undeploy them, and I was going to redeploy them back. So that's, have I given you some idea of how to make those decisions? All right. Key factors: situational awareness, be where you can best command your forces, anticipate decision points, maintain focus on priority of effort. Key points, yes.
At the beginning you had mentioned when you were talking to General Walls, you'd asked the question, where should I be? Where should I be to best lead my team? And you'd come to the conclusion that it wasn't in the rear.
Right.
I'm just curious, where was it in terms of, at one extreme, like on the battle, I'm not saying you weren't on the battlefield, but at the front, and the other at the rear. I'm just curious where you ended up in between those 2.
I'll try to show you on the, I think. So this is my small team. I had signal, I had an interpreter, we had operations, we had logistics. So this is the small team that I used. This is assault command post called Snake Assault. We were called Snakes. And this is at the point of crossing to Iraq. And I'm going to show you on a map.
Okay.
Yeah, got that. So this is some of the mobility capability. This was actually designed to be a chemical biologic protective system. And we found out it would work very well when we deployed forward surgical teams who might be in the environments of chemical and biological warfare. So not only were they the response team, I had some of these for response to the potential for chemical warfare that would set up the chemical decontamination, which was a medical responsibility. But we also used them aligned as the forward surgical team, and here's inside one of those shelters. So it had positive pressure, so it was able to operate even under environments of chemical warfare, which was, as I told you, an unknown factor that we had the war game and with a high probability of being exposed to it. This is some of the things that happened in the future, so I'm going to come back to this. We didn't have combat application tourniquets that you put on yourself. We didn't have hemostatic dressings that would allow clotting to occur. We were still using the old World War II dressings. We didn't have, and a tourniquet that we would war game was just a stick with a cravat, so which never worked. It never worked, and this was probably more influential in saving lives because we realized that loss of blood was the number one reason why lives were lost. And then hypothermia. As soon as you're injured, you start to go into this need for. So we would put a blanket to retain heat, body heat, immediately to save lives, reduced injuries post. And we started really doing pain control because pain control more effectively on the battlefield. So these are some of the things that happened as a performance improvement outcome after what we set up to do. Okay, here's the map. So we started Kuwait. This was one of the hospitals, the mobile hospital, 212th MASH. I told you I commanded the 5th MASH at Fort Bragg. 5th MASH was the one that dropped out of airplanes. Then I went on to command something called the 28th Combat Support Hospital. So right here, I'm very familiar with this because these are two units like the ones I'd commanded previously. The difference is the 5th MASH and 28th are designed that you could drop them from the sky and set them up. In 6 hours, we'd be ready for surgery. And then my small command post. So why here? This was going to be a major operating, what we call a forward support base, a forward operating base. So between here and here and here, we leapfrog. This was a 72-hour drive, by the way. So this is a continuous 72-hour drive. 4 days of driving, yeah. And so we or three plus days. And there's a story to that. So from here, we were leapfrogging forward surgical teams as we were moving up with the maneuver force. 3rd Infantry Division was basically here. 1st MEF was basically over here. Some other smaller components, and 5th Corps occupied this as we were moving on. This is Marines. And then as the Marines moved forward, the Brits followed behind, and then they occupied this area down here. And then eventually all of this area down here. So everything shifted as we, so the 212th was set up, and we were the first ones actually in this forward operating base. And I remember going to General Wallace and saying, on the map, I'm surrounded in the middle by hundreds of units, but they never made it yet, because we were pretty highly mobile. And I said, I need some security. And he said, because there was no, I can look around, 2 kilometers around is just this little hospital in the middle of the desert, right where we were supposed to be, but there was supposed to be a Patriot battery, a logistics unit, an engineering unit, and a maintenance unit all around us. And he said, and I went to talk to the G3, and he said, Don, I have nobody to give you. You can either shut down and move into into here, which is about 2 kilometers away, or you can defend yourself. Just realize that if they find you, they'll want to kill you. And I said, okay, we war game this. We war game how to defend ourselves. And that night, I was lucky. One of my former 5th MASH soldiers who became a special operator walked by, recognized me, and said, what do you need? And I said, can you walk around a little bit and see if there's anything that looks unusual? And he came back about 2 hours later and said, there's 2 houses over there about a click away. He said, the good news is we walked up to them up there and they didn't shoot at us, but the bad news is they didn't shoot at us. So we have no idea whether they're, friendly forces or unfriendly forces. And so we were blessed with the worst sandstorm in months, and we continued to operate. And then the next day, the forces started to surround us. So medical forces need to understand how to play the role when it becomes necessary of a combat force. And the way we always word it is, every individual has a right to defend himself. He has a right to defend his life. Every medical person has a responsibility to defend his patients. So you have to understand what it's going to take to defend your patients. And that's why we train for combat operations, different than typical medical operations. Okay, this is what the MASH looks like when it's set up. We have a small helipad set up. I don't know. This is a little while later, and we didn't have that kind of fixed stand for the helicopters. Basically, 36 beds with 2 operating ISO shelters, like I showed you. This is the ISO shelters that are set up that will allow you to have 2 operating tables in each ISO shelter. So 4 operating tables, 36 beds, all the full radiology and laboratory capability and blood. Now, this is what it looked like before we set up the hard stand. And it wasn't a pleasant thing to have this happen. So I'm going to point this out. These are called auxiliary fuel tanks. And while we were, so you saw where we were located. We were about halfway to Baghdad, a little bit more than halfway to Baghdad. We were consolidating forces, resetting up the missiles, the Patriot missiles, because Scuds were still active. And we were getting scudded about once a day, and never accurate, but always a disruption. So when we were attacking, when we finished the assault on Baghdad, we made the decision to take these auxiliary tanks off, and this reduced our distance. When you go back, you see my evacuation distance from here to Kuwait, and there was nothing really in between here, which is 300 miles. The helicopter had about 150 miles in it. So we had to set up the auxiliary tanks, allowed us to go a little longer than that, but we had an ambulance exchange point set up in Al-Nazariya here. So we'd fly a helicopter from here to here and here to here. We designed the system so that we would turn over the hospital, 36 beds, every 18 hours. We anticipated having enough casualties flow through. So every 18 hours, we would have to have the entire hospital evacuated. And that was using a certain number of medevacs, a certain number with 6 stands in each medevac, and we had a little medical capability set up, the air ambulance exchange point. With auxiliary tanks, it could go all the way. Without the auxiliary tanks, we had to do the exchange point. So now we were severely constrained for what next. Here's Baghdad, here's the Karbala Gap, here's the Revolutionary Guard, and this is where heavy combat was anticipated to take place. And you hear in the news, Fallujah and Mosul and Kirkuk rather, and Mosul's up here, I don't have it showing here. But west of Baghdad is all of that bad space. Al-Ramadi, Fallujah, that's all in this area here. So we still had our main force consolidated here, waiting to bring everybody up so that we can execute that assault across Karbala Gap. But to execute the assault across Karbala Gap, I had to degrade my ambulance evacuation capability. So I had to wait for additional forces to come, ambulance capability. And what we had working was the construction of a fixed landing strip. There's a field landing strip. It's a better picture of this here. There it is. The hospital's right here. And so now they have the capability of carrying pretty much the full hospital if they land there. So that is what allowed us to attack Baghdad. It took a few days of engineering assets that we had to carry with us to do this. And we certified for 25 landings, did 19 landings. And then at that point, we had already assaulted Baghdad and had Baghdad Airport secured so we could start landing C-130s at Baghdad Airport. The day before we launched, the 18th, I flew down to Doha camp because my forces were just right at the edge of the battle space, just at the edge of Kuwait. So we flew down to the city of Kuwait where they call the CENTCOM forward headquarters was, and so CENTCOM. So there was an Air Force component, Army component, and a Navy component that was located there. It was a beautiful, beautiful facility. I remember how I didn't use the toilets at all because I didn't want to. My troops couldn't, so I wasn't going to. So that was. But I went to talk to the Air Force to make sure that they were going to land in this field landing strip, and I came back after a few hours of waiting there, and they said that the 3-star said, "We're not landing there. It's too dangerous." I said, "You have to, because we wargame. That's the only way we're going to be able to assault Baghdad." And they said it's too dangerous. So I immediately flew back to our site, walked over to General Wallace's tent, and said, "Sir, we got a problem. Air Force is refusing to land at our field landing strip, our FLS." And you know what he said? "Don't worry, Don. If we build it, they will land. I swear to God." And they did. That's the brilliance of leadership. That's what you have to somehow get to when you start talking about developing the leaders of our medical community. Don't worry. If we build it, they will land. So after that, I'll tell you, you saw me, I was doing this thing where I had a hospital set up and a hospital prepared to move, hospital set up, and then right here was the 10th Combat Support Hospital was going to be prepared to move up there. So I leapfrogged hospitals, and their position of waiting to be moved was right next to an existing hospital, so I can use the assets, personnel assets. I always say I can maneuver 4 things on the battlefield. I can maneuver units, hospitals, and other capabilities. I can maneuver equipment from those units, or I can maneuver staff from those units, or I can maneuver patients. There's a small story about evacuating forward. Remember I told you about these long lines? Gosh, I'm about out of time, aren't I?
No rush. Keep going.
Yeah. When the 212 filled and we had some flying conditions that didn't allow us to fly, that 18-hour turnover suddenly became difficult. And we had, in preparing around here, I had a forward surgical team, kind of in a forward prepared movement to go with the assault force. They were aligned with the assault force. And so I moved the patients from the hospital forward on the battlefield to the capability that existed until we can get air, permission to fly. The air became more permissive. So that was one of the little stories about agility, knowing where your assets are so that you can make a decision. And it may be something totally contrary to any doctrine. Evacuate forward. Well, we needed to move patients to a place where they could be cared for. My team, we just got the mission order to take on, to move forward into Baghdad. All those units, these are the leaders and these are their sergeant majors, and this was a mission brief that I was giving them. Their job then is to take my mission, understand their component of that, and brief back to me how they're going to execute their component of the mission that I gave them. And I was receiving my mission, and my team, my staff had to do that same thing. And so that's the way it works on the battlefield. These are the two brigade commanders, Chuck Hightower and Jay Harmon, and the three, I guess, are Russ Surf. We do this thing called military decision-making process, and it's basically the same thing. Receive the mission, give a warning order, a mission's been received, do the analysis of the mission, give a warning order, what the analysis is showing, do course of action development, kind of look across which course of action seems to make the most sense, do the comparison, then get the commander's approval, give the next warning order, and then start to develop the operation order. That's MDMP. You rehearse this, you execute this in everything you do. It keeps everybody informed, and it allows for some anticipation of a future requirement before you actually receive the future requirement. I like this system. I don't know if that's been thought of as how do we convey information in a way that allows people to anticipate. That's an important part of it. This is a 296-bed hospital set up on the airfield of Balad. And anticipating future force requirements, I said, we can only sustain this for about a year or 2 years. We need to build a fixed facility. So if you go back and look at the 2005 CENTCOM MIPL, Master Integrated Project List, 3 of the top 5 MILCON, military construction requirements, were my projects. A medical logistics center here, and a new fixed facility constructed. So that movement to sustainment base didn't happen by chance. I had to call in a team of facility engineers that spent more than almost 2 months with my staff just designing the facility, putting the requirements together that would get us to a fixed hospital at the earliest possible point. I have to admit this is a little bit of personal objective. 7 years in Serbia, Bosnia, 5 years in Kosovo. I wanted 3 years in Iraq. That was my goal. So we made it about 4 years before it was done. So people ask me, what was the greatest thing you achieved when you were in Iraq? And I'll say, it was building the hospital. Well, it was 4 years after, but it would not have happened if we hadn't worked to get it on the MILCON funding line. That's vision, strategy, those things that. Okay, here we go. So this is what it looked like when we were finally arrayed, and then we branched out some small capabilities for surgical teams here in the Western Desert. We had the MASH no longer became necessary because we were doing flights straight into Baghdad, and then we were doing flights up to Balad. So we took this down eventually, and I used this in Baghdad to help me do the hospital reconstruction effort. And then we took this down in Baghdad and integrated it across here and into this area. I don't think we put a new hospital here, but we did augment these hospitals. So as we were moving and we had more air capability, we redesigned the entire system. But it was designed to be redesigned, if I may make that comment. You haven't seen a hospital move that one on the battlefield into a fixed. We spent, probably about $50 million renovating this hospital. This was Saddam's hospital, right in the middle of the green zone. Baghdad ER, this is what it looked like before we got it reconstructed and ready. And then these things started happening. So this was moving into sustainment-based operation. Fixed facilities, CT MRIs, physical therapy brought in so we didn't have evacuation. We can do return to duties directly by having physical therapy aligned in that space. We found out, microbiology was needed, pathology was needed. One of the most common reasons for evacuation was a OBGYN colposcopy. So they would go back to launch stool for a 20-minute evaluation and be there for 2 weeks. So we brought an OBGYN forward, we brought pathology forward. We brought that capability forward from launch stool instead of evacuating back to launch stool. Those are the kinds of things you learn from evaluating your system and redesigning it. Okay, measure outcomes. Joint theater trauma system, joint theater trauma registry. Brilliant thing. John Holcomb, anybody from Texas, Houston? John was the commander of a research center called the Burn Unit down in San Antonio, and he came up with this idea, the JTTS, JTTR, flew out to Baghdad, and then we implemented that, and that's the best source of let me say data that has to do with viability or life-sustaining data. So we kind of mimic this in the Vision Center with the Viver, the registry that I told you. We follow that same lesson learned and that same pathway of designing a system so you can be sure that you have really great information. You're not just operating off of bad information. So any information that goes in the Viver is evaluated 3 tiers of quality assurance. You can't use databases that only give you a number, ICD-10, ICD. It's useless. You need to know the phenotypic variations of that. I always say there's 4 things to a good clinical registry: phenotypic precision, time course characterization capability, and you can look at outcomes over time. If it's trauma, I say event forensics, understand why, if the outcome was different, could it have been related to the event? And then the third thing that we're working on now is the genomic descriptors. So we think that some people don't deal well with trauma. Their systems get activated. The gene activation process becomes more harmful than the injury themselves. And so that's what we're discovering in some of this traumatic brain injury work. And anticipate future requirements. You heard me talk about this. So this counterinsurgency operation, just a brief comment on that. When we hit Baghdad, it became clear to General Wallace that our enemy was no longer Iraqi armed forces. Actually, they were our friends. We were trying to pull them in. The first member of the new Iraqi army was the Surgeon General. I appointed him. His name was Samir Hassan. Remember, he walked in my headquarters and he said, "Come on with me." He raised his right hand and he said, "What just happened?" I said, "You're now the first member of the new Iraqi army. Congratulations, Colonel." He retired as a 2-star general and is now part of the Ministry of Health. We still exchange on LinkedIn. This is kind of what I talked about, the movement. But what's different and why why we did so well was pushing surgery forward, linking it to the hospital, but pushing it forward for a capability. Yeah. Okay. We were very effective in evacuating and eventually became very effective in giving care during the evacuation. Something that was a part of the performance improvement. That theater trauma system, we did some comparisons. Does it really justify my replacement? And the 30th was the 2nd Med Brigade, and they looked at some numbers. 6,500 evaluations, a population of 200,000. In a level 1 trauma center, 5,000 evaluations in a population of 2 million, so definitely a need. And it required us to put people on the ground to look at the data before it got entered into the record. Actually hand jamming the data into the record because we wanted to be sure it was good quality data. Overall, 25% decrease in combat deaths. This gives some idea of how that compares to previous wars. KIA, 12%, down from 21% in Vietnam. Died of wounds, 4%, and mostly due to higher injuring kinds of weapons. The overall, though, 8.8%, about 9% down from 16% from Vietnam.
What
Pretty
does
good.
CFR stand for?
Huh? Combined fatality rate. Yeah. Okay, just more of the same. And then I got this little read. This is every day. I got this read about how many admissions there were there any, because this gave me a sense of were there any outbreaks that I needed to be aware of. Could they have been an environmental issue, or could they have just been a disease outbreak? We had a big problem with leishmaniasis in the beginning that had to be addressed. It's another story. All right, I already made this point, and we, not while I was there, but over the subsequent years, we established forward deployed medical capabilities through teleradiology and telemedicine. And I will say, here's Dr. Samir. It's his first public appearance, and it's the first person in the new. That was the whole new Iraqi army at that point. It was when I was leaving, and General Reynolds from the 2nd Med Brigade was taking over. There he is signing with the Ministry of Health to get support from the Ministry of Health to help us build the military capability back, and that's something that you don't think of. I had a team aligned with the ministry support, mostly Ministry of Health. These ministries were the ones I was dealing with. And I'm going to just conclude with something that I'll call the Iraqi Medical Societies. And this is the meeting after. This is Dr. Mahmoud Abbas, who is the Minister of Health, and Dr. Shaker, who was the person that treated Rhonda Cornum that I called the American hero earlier. And we, when I'm just going to end with this story, and then I'll do the conclusion. Integration. My chief of clinical operations was a Macedonian major, so we truly were a coalition staff. The British, we had an integrated healthcare. No soldier, regardless of American or otherwise, would be moved to a hospital other than the nearest hospital. We didn't have people move into their Polish hospital, their British. We couldn't afford that, and we had agreements put in place. I'm going to kind of flash past this and get to, I've already covered a lot of this, so my apologies for flashing through this. So I like to conclude with this was Ron Crow, the 212 MASH, and that humanitarian mission and being the humanity in the melee can't be better conveyed, in my opinion, than this photo. This is the 212 MASH executive officer during a time of high combat operations. One quick story. So one of the things I'm really most proud of is I remember receiving in April a message, April 29th, congratulating me on my wife's birthday, April 30th, very thoughtful of the person who wrote it, and reminding me that I promised that we would host an international medical conference in Baghdad before I left. They had one scheduled in May and canceled it. Baghdad used to be the centerpiece for medicine in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia contingency of 26 people, half doctors, came in. I was escorting them. And half of them trained in Baghdad. And so it was the place, they were in tears, because it was the place where medicine was most notable. And then under Saddam's rule, it just disintegrated. So my goal was, this sounds like something, gosh, what's the battlefield commander thing? To reduce the potential of the medical brain drain. If you want to build capability, you have to sustain, one, the education process, and you have to sustain the existing assets. If everybody left Baghdad after we arrived, there's no way I could have had a capability in Iraq that we did have. So how do I do that? One of my ways to do that was I used to say, we're going to put Baghdad back on the map, and it will be a place of respect for healthcare, and we're going to start doing this with a medical conference. So I left the 17th of February. We held the Iraqi Medical Specialty Forum on the 14th through the 17th of February. And brought in, so the way I kind of looked at this, I remember I walked in the Ministry of Health and said, give Iraqi doctors a voice. It was written in big letters. Well, what's my voice? So what's your voice as systems engineers? Right here. So I'm a member of the American Medical Association, the Retina Society, the American Academy of Ophthalmology, American College of Healthcare Executives, the American Association of Physician Leaders, and that's my voice to the government about advocacy for the practice of systems engineering or the practice of medicine. And we push for the government to change their rules and policies as organizations to influence the outcome of our area, of our field. So I started looking around, and there were counterpart Iraqi societies, except all the leadership was appointed by Saddam, and they served in their capacity as the leaders as long as they served Saddam. So I set about to do what was our end state? A free and democratic Iraq. So how could I, one, push democratic processes into the medical arena, and two, how can we influence our small part to get to a free and democratic Iraq. I remember when I first briefed Ambassador Kennedy, the number 2 guy under Bremer, and I told him my idea. He said, "This is great." He said, "More of us need to be doing this kind of thing." You know, my goal was to align the Iraqi medical societies with the U.S. and U.K. medical societies, and to share the information about what makes them succeed using democratic processes, their code of ethics, their bylaws, their charter, and those things that allow them to operate in a democratic fashion. So the goal was to bring in those counterparts to a meeting in Baghdad, the Iraqi Medical Specialty Forum, and to have those documents shared with the counterpart society. So there's a picture there. I don't need to show it, but there were 26 members of the societies and 6 UK members. We brought 32 people in. It's the first non-governmental international conference in the post-Iraq period. We originally spent $700,000 renovating the Baghdad Conference Center. It's part of my CERP funds. And we had to move it. We were agile enough. We had to move it into the green zone, into the convention center, because we had intelligence that there was intent to bomb that conference. And we, in fact, found some explosives that had been placed in there. And so we moved it we had a backup plan. We had enough space for 700 people. In 4 hours with no communications, we filled the conference room. I remember when Kennedy said, Bremer needs to be there for this. I looked at his calendar and said, he's briefing the president that day, but I'll change that. This is more important. Meanwhile, the Bar Association, Professional Engineer Association, were all watching on how they could follow and do the same thing. So in 3 years, member-elected leaders adopting your own charter, bylaws, code of ethics, and non-discriminating. And then we would grant you membership of the counterpart society. It worked for about half the societies, and it became something called the MAI, and I get calls from people's stories that says, your MAI is still active, and this is even 5, 6, 7 years later. So that was probably one of you talk about sustaining effect that bring good value. So that was one of those. And my concluding words are, people often ask me, so what was the hardest thing about being in Iraq? And I give him my one-word answer, leaving. So I apologize for going over, and I appreciate your attention.
Thank you.